Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. Our guest today is Bennett. He is a social psychologist, entrepreneur, author, humorist, producer, programmer, and much, much more. In today's stream of constant information, it would be understandable to assume that access to truth is in abundance. Yet, it is lies that get us through our lives. Expect to learn about the logical fallacies that control your life, why these logical fallacies are so easy and so common, what to do about them, and much, much more. Bo and I have a great conversation today, so without further ado, everyone, Bo Bennett. There are so many logical fallacies in the book. Why do we believe the lies when, I guess anatomically humans have such a large prefrontal cortex that would, theoretically make logic larger in our lives than it is? Why do we believe these lies so often? Why do they help us?
In short, it's cognitively easier to not challenge your own beliefs, to believe what people tell you. There's two types of thinking that the cognitive psychologist Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky noted. One was level one thinking and level two. Basically, one is just very passive, where information comes in and you really don't give it much thought. It takes very little cognitive energy. And the other type is where critical thinking lies, where you have to really think about what is being presented and evaluate it and critically think about every aspect of it. And that takes a lot of cognitive energy. And because of that, our bodies and our mind, everything, we don't like to do it. We don't like to expend energy. We like to conserve energy. That's like the natural state of our body. That's what we try to do. So it's a more difficult. It takes it takes more effort, and you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware that you need to do it at times, because if you don't, your default mode will kick in, and you'll just kind of check out and accept the information that comes in. So I want to comment on your intuition thing, and that's an interesting one you chose because it's a typical fashion, like with the logical fallacies. A lot of them are fine in the realm of normal communication and everyday life. It becomes a logical fallacy when it's used in argumentation. So specifically what you were talking about, like the appeal to intuition, appeal to gut, like technically there's nothing wrong with that, because this is basically just a way that we can be more efficient in our thinking, and it tends to work the majority of the time. So when we talk about intuition from a scientific perspective, what we're talking about is like the sum of all of our reasoning, everything that we learned, all of our education, kind of like in a black box somewhere in our brain. And when information comes in, we can make a decision and it says, yeah, this just feels right. Well, it feels right probably because you've been through this before, and subconsciously you feel like this is the right decision. And this is what's called a heuristic. As a heuristic, it tends to work very well, in that maybe 80% of the time you'll be right. So when it's like a very insignificant decision that you need to make, then heuristics work beautifully. Intuition, gut feelings work beautifully. Like, oh, I'm driving my car. I'm going to my friend's house. Wait, do I go this way or this way? It feels like this way. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a life-threatening situation. It's not a major life decision. If you get it wrong, if you're in the 20%, who cares? You back up, you turn around. That's the way the human mind works, and that's the beautiful part about it. It can be very efficient. Where this is a fallacy, a logical fallacy, is in argumentation. So say you're arguing with somebody and they make an argument about whatever, Mormonism. and you say, well, you know what? This just feels right to me. It feels like this is the right religion. So therefore it is. That is completely and totally fallacious. And that's where the logical fallacy, the appeal to intuition, comes in. You can't use your intuition in arguments with somebody else. It doesn't work, because think about it from your perspective. If somebody says, it just feels right, then what does that tell you? Where's the evidence? It's nowhere. And of course, you get like 10 different people and they could all feel different ways. So all their intuition could point to different things and it doesn't help out any. So that's just a good distinction between where what might be a logical fallacy is fine in the real world in everyday use, but when it comes to argumentation or really critical thinking, when you want the answer and you want to get as close to 100% as possible, that's when you have to ditch your intuition and go to something a little bit deeper.
Are these logical fallacies, or do you think they're strictly because of the kind of calorie conservation efforts of the brain, right? 5% of our mass, 25% of our energy, budget, so to speak. Do you think not thinking about these things is strictly because of energy conservation?
No, it's part of it. It might be a large part of it, but there's certainly more to it. If we look at evolution, I guess that it's along the same line as evolution, because like evolutionarily speaking, we want to conserve energy. But more than that, evolutionarily speaking, we want to reproduce and we want to survive. That's it. That's really all evolution cares about. It doesn't care about if we get arguments right about whether Donald Trump did steal or did really win the election or not. It doesn't care about that. It only cares about our survival and reproduction. So if you think about like where these logical arguments and reasoning and this high level thought started to come in our evolutionary process, our evolutionary history, it wasn't really that long ago. So we haven't quite evolved to think that way. So that's why it's a lot more deliberate, a lot more manual process than it should be.
It makes me feel that winning an argument can make you feel more alone, and so any any feeling of solitude means death in our biology, in our ancestry. And so it makes me think, man, if you want to have friends, maybe you don't try to win arguments. But how do you
it depends on your social groups, because
Sure.
Yes, we are in a social species, meaning that we need this kind of social bonding. And if you argue against somebody, well, you're separating yourself from them, which seems like a bad thing. But if you're in a group where everybody believes the same thing, then it's kind of like the opposite. You want to argue in order to keep that position, in order to keep your social bonds with that group, which, by the way, and you probably know this more than most people, is one of the main reasons that people don't leave religions or never question their religion. Religion is such a huge part of people's culture and their social groups and their social bonds. And some religions, if you decide like, I'm sorry, I don't believe in that anymore, then you're going to be outcast and you're going to be shunned. And we've even seen many situations where children are kicked out of the house because of their beliefs, like under 18. So it could be very powerful, the whole idea of social bonds, to accept an argument or to reject an argument.
Absolutely. So one of the things I loved in the introduction of your book, I'm going to read straight from it. In the first edition of your book, opponent, I believe was the word. I don't have that part highlighted, but You decided, and this is the following phrase. I use the terms, no, that's not it. There you go. Where is it? Sorry, I highlighted the wrong part. But you go on to say this. I use the terms arguer and interlocutor or audience to represent the one making the argument and the person or persons considering the argument, respectively. So first of all, I appreciate that you changed that. I think that is a common. I certainly fall into this all the time, where the person I'm debating with, just because I actually love to debate, I tend to then think of the person on the other side of the debate as the person that I need to kind of conquer. I need to win this debate. And so I love that change. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Bo, though. I do feel that sometimes I am both the arguer, the interlocutor, and the audience. I feel that oftentimes I'm having conversations with self. there's almost two voices in my head that I'm having a conversation with at times, debating certain things, thinking things through. I can almost, as I read through some of these fallacies, I can see myself, talking to myself and like, oh man, as I mull over this topic or thing, oh, I actually use this to have a conversation with myself. So, in your experience and obviously with your expertise in analyzing these fallacies, do you think there is a how do we argue? How do we debate with self when it's me, myself, and I? Have you thought about that much?
Yeah, this is how we figure things out. There's a constant inner dialogue, and that's completely normal and completely healthy. And it also means that critical thinking is activated when you start arguing with yourself. Basically what you're doing is you have these beliefs or these ideas, and then you start to challenge yourself on that. Maybe you come across new information. Maybe you start to realize that these beliefs or ideas that you held might not be based on evidence or factual. So you start that dialogue, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as you mentioned, that's a great way, a great reason to want to learn about fallacies, because in your self argumentation, you want to make sure that you're not committing these fallacies with yourself. You want to make sure that when you do come to a conclusion, it's based on a good, sound, logical, valid argument rather than something that might be fallacious.
I need to spend more time personally going through all these ones that I marked, just because I read them as I was going through the book, thought, oh, I do this, I do this with self, I do this with others. Once we Is it just an awareness, you think, that we're doing these things that is kind of the major, I guess, piece to fixing this in our own communication and our own debates? Is awareness really the key, or what would, for you, Bo, like what's a step by step that someone can take to kind of start fixing these fallacies that they're applying to self and others?
Yeah, first is the education, the knowledge, knowing what the logical fallacies are. That's incredibly important. Then that leads to the second step, which is awareness. And then the third step would be implementing that awareness, and making sure that you start to critically think and evaluate your ideas using this education, this information, these logical fallacies that you now know about. So that's kind of like the three-step process, but awareness is a huge part of that. Because if you're not aware that you're actually doing this, or that other people are committing these fallacies, then what's the point? They're going to just slip by you anyway.
Can you run me through maybe your 5 favorite fallacies? I know it's a little on the spot, but do you have a
Yeah.
list of your kind of like favorites of if there's a Venn diagram of, the most common and the most egregious, whatever
Yeah.
overlap is there? I'd love to have you walk us through, maybe your top 5 favorites that you think about often, or see often, or have hilarious stories or examples along with them.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if I could pull off five, even though there are 300 in the book. And if you noticed in the book, in the back of the book, I think I have like Bo's top 25 or something. And
Oh, there we go.
those are the most significant ones. So in the book, I write like, if you don't have a lot of time, if you don't want to read this 420 something page book and learn all these fallacies, just focus on these, because this will get you pretty much like 80%, 90% of the way there. And then all the rest kind of fall in at the tail end of that bell curve there with the use of the logical fallacies. So just to get started, I think the what we see probably the most often, if this is the number one, is the straw man fallacy. And this is the idea that you're making an argument that the other person didn't make, or you're arguing something that the other person didn't make. You're getting off the argument And the reason is because it's easier to argue against something that the person didn't say than like a good argument that the person made. And we see this in politics all the time because people will bring up, like opponents of other politicians will bring up like a really good point or something that the politician did that was a complete disaster or something along those lines. And the politician doesn't want to talk about that. So they spin it and they talk about something else. And they say, well, the reason I did that and all the good things that happened, and they completely go off the track and they're not addressing the argument, but they're addressing like a completely different argument. And that's called a straw man. You see that all the time in politics. If you watch any of the presidential debates, you will see that pretty much every question. And what kills me is that very few people get called out on that. Now, I should say that I am a little bit happy that in the debating context, usually people say you're not answering the question. Like this isn't you completely missed it. You do hear that like in the debating platform, but when you don't hear that is you don't hear that. You rarely hear this in like in interviews on the news when like a politician or somebody's being interviewed and they're not answering the question. I get so frustrated when the person doing the interview just completely ignores that and treats them like they did answer the question. It makes me think, okay, wait, are they just completely not listening? And you know that happens sometimes when people interview, they have a whole list of questions and they just go off one question at a time and they're not even like taking, it's not a conversation. So
It's
that
so
kind of,
frustrating.
yeah,
I
annoys
wish
me.
there was it's not often that we have a structured, moderator, a
Right.
structured debate, because, everything's kind of, and everything you're presenting arguments and everything you're trying to make a point and everything you're trying to persuade, convince, do something of the sort. And so, yeah, we need we need professional moderators in every scene. I do love, I feel like I see more of it now. At least I get more clips of it on my feed. That may be a fallacy to think that it's happening more nowadays than it has in the past. But I do see more kind of clips, at least on the internet, of news anchors. Hey, whoa, not what I asked. Like, please ask
Yeah.
the question. It's like, oh,
And
thank you. Like,
that's why these clips are viral because it happens so
yeah,
infrequently that when
yeah,
it does, people want to share it and say, yes, look what this person did. They actually confronted them when they're not answering the question.
yeah,
So number two, I'm not sure, again, we'll get to five, but at least a
sure.
second one that really comes to
And
mind.
I have questions about plenty of others, so we're gonna
Okay.
go through a bunch.
Okay. The second one that really comes to mind is this what sometimes you hear as the shotgun approach, where and you hear this in debate context all the time. Somebody will get up there and they'll list like 10, 15 different points that the person could never possibly address within 2 minutes or however long that they have. Or if they're on like an interview on the news, they can't possibly address all this, even though like they may say, okay, so you killed your wife, you like they could just keep on naming all these ridiculous things that the person never did, but because the person can't possibly respond to all of it, the audience will listen to that and say, wow, I can't believe they did all that, and they'll be persuaded by it. So in a way it's a fallacy in a way if you are the audience listening to this approach and you're actually buying into it, like you accept all of those points that the first person is making without giving the other person a chance to respond to it. The way it should work is you don't accept any of those points. Like nothing is settled until each point is discussed and debated. And only then, when you have information, like good information on both sides of like one point, do you make up your mind and judgment about that. But again, this is critical thinking. Most people don't think critically. Most people are just persuaded by by rhetoric like this and techniques. So that's why you see a lot when people get on the debate stage, they just start rattling off all of these ridiculous things that could easily be fact checked too. And when you do fact check them, you see like, oh, this is completely and totally false.
But the
But
damage is done.
the damage is done. And it's
Yeah.
like the whole idea of the headlines. So a newspaper will print a headline that's completely false, and then the next day they'll have the retraction, in the retraction section on like page 12 or something. But it doesn't matter. Like 90% of the people seen it, they believe it, and that's it. And then like a very small percentage will actually see the retraction and then accept the retraction. And even if, this is the crazy thing, even if the retraction is just as big and just as prominent and the distribution is the same, people will still tend to believe the false statement because it's easier. And that's the way people think, unfortunately.
One of the humorous ones that I think the population that is on X, aka Twitter, seems to use a lot is reductio ad Hitlerium. Hitlerum. Please tell me more about this. Yeah.
Right. So reducing the argument to Hitler, like if
Yep.
you bring in Hitler, then it's just like
You win.
silly. Yeah. Because like if
Yep.
Hitler is like the most despised person in history, or at least he used to be, I don't know now, unfortunately. But when you bring in Hitler, it's like, oh geez, you're associating this person with Hitler, then that's like the worst person in the world, therefore you win. And it's really funny the context in which it's done, because some things are like not at all like Hitler, or they take something like Hitler had a mustache, and because you have a mustache, therefore you're like Hitler. And they try to destroy you, or destroy your credibility, destroy your likability, your morality, whatever, by associating you with one of these horrible dictators, usually Hitler, because most people know that he's probably the most famous of the tyrannical dictators.
Sure.
And it's a fallacy, because you have to think whenever you compare somebody to somebody else, or two things to each other, it doesn't even have to be that specific. You have to say not only in what ways are they alike, but in what ways are they not alike. So that's the whole picture. So I'm like Hitler in that I'm a man and Hitler was a man. So in
You're screwed.
that way,
You're screwed, Bo.
yeah, exactly. I'm like Hitler. Hey, well, you're in that
facial
boat too,
hair. So. Yeah, we're all screwed.
Right. So you could say that, but that's ridiculous if you think about it. And then you have to say, okay, like what ways are we not like Hitler? And then you start listing, the many different ways. And then, so that's the whole picture. That's what you have to do when not only somebody compares somebody to Hitler, but when somebody compares two things to each other, to try to associate something with a very bad thing or with a very good thing. It could work both ways. And again, the cognitively expedient way to go is just to listen to what they have to say, think about the one thing that they associated, and your mind is kind of made up, or you're persuaded on that fact. Because in order to think about all the other things that the person didn't say, like the ways the person is not like Hitler, that takes a lot more energy. And not only that, but in the context of the argument or the conversation, there's no time to do that. There's no time to do that mental evaluation, because the conversation keeps going on. So people don't do it. So it's not completely their fault. Even if they wanted to, they don't have the time, essentially. But here's where the knowledge of logical fallacies come into play. When you know this, when you know about this argument and you know about these mental tricks, when you hear somebody compare somebody to Hitler for whatever reason, it doesn't even register. Like you're saying, yeah, I'm not even going to accept that because you know this trick.
Is that a double fallacy? Because claiming that someone is similar to Hitler is an ad hominem as well.
Yeah,
meaning that you're attacking their character, thus invalidating their point. Whereas even Hitler probably, said a couple things that are true factually, right?
Right, exactly. So when that's like another, probably like the third most common, or one of the most common, the top 5 at least, common fallacies, the whole ad hominem. It's because you're a jerk, therefore you can't be right. Because you're a dictator, or you act like a dictator, you can't be right about this point. It's a way to muddy the argument and get the focus off the argument and on the person, and then try to say, well, this person is bad, ugly, wrong, whatever, and therefore what they're saying is false. And that's not the case. That's not the way to think. You have to evaluate the argument on its own merits, regardless of who is actually making the argument and who is saying it. So you could have like, even, and I tell people this, just think of your, like the news source that you think is the most ridiculous and wrong the most like amount of time, and it doesn't mean that everything that comes from that news source is false. There are some true things. A nice non-political one I like to think about is the national, not the National Enquirer. Oh boy, I forgot the name of it now. When I was growing up, it was the typical supermarket rag where they had like aliens visiting the president, and the president was really an alien. The like all these the crazy things. It's not the National Enquirer. Oh boy,
It sounds like if the Onion put together a comic strip.
Yeah. But the funny thing is, like that ridiculous paper that I'm referring to, which the name slips me at this point, the they even had things in there that were either true or based on truth. So you can't dismiss everything from a source, no matter how ridiculous the source is. But, and this goes back to one of the first thing we talked about, is the whole idea of heuristics. Dismissing, not dismissing, I should say, being extremely critical of an argument because of the source is perfectly valid and a good idea when you're thinking critically and you're trying to be reasonable. And the reason for this is because, again, we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of cognitive energy. We can't click on our level 2 system thinking about everything. It just would never work that way. It's impossible, the time wise, source wise. So we have to use these heuristics. So a good example is like if somebody says, I read in the National, let's just use National Enquirer. I know that's like a bunch of smut too. I read in the National Enquirer
all smut, all of it,
that the president is doing drugs in the Oval Office. So you could say, yeah, I doubt. You could immediately say, yeah, you know what? I really doubt that's true. But if you want to have like a serious argument about this, why don't you bring me some evidence that's not associated with the National Enquirer? And then they could say, well, that's a logical fallacy. Just because it's in the Enquirer doesn't. Well, no, I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm saying that I don't believe it. I'm not convinced by what the National Enquirer says. I need some more. I need some what we call evidence, and that is not evidence. Somebody could argue that is evidence, but we could say that's like the weakest level of evidence that there is. It doesn't even really qualify as legitimate evidence.
Yeah, it's equivalent to hearsay.
Yeah, essentially, but I mean, probably not even that. A lot of times, these kind of really supermarket tabloid type of things, they just make things up.
It makes me think of Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis. If you know who they are, Hollywood actors, they're married, they're driving in a car. Yeah, I think so. But the Mila, the wife, she holds up one of the tabloids, and it's like, oh, Ashton and Mila are getting a divorce. Or getting a divorce, and she looks at Ash and she's like, babe, did you know we're getting a divorce? It's like, oh my gosh, this is unreal what they're putting out here. No, they're awesome. I think they're funny. Fleshing out, having a structured debate between two average people, structured, well thought out, well evidenced. It takes a lot of time. It's also kind of boring. What role does boredom have in the role that we don't present solid evidence? In a way, it's more fun just to jump from fallacy to fallacy and just there. It's almost, you're not even there to like really make a debate, or you're not really even there to like put forth any evidence. Not really there. You just want to like talk about the things that you want to talk about. I've certainly found myself in this where just because I love talking about ideas, I'll just get going. So I'm curious, like, what role you think boredom might have to play in this?
I'll answer that in a second. World Weekly News. That's what I was thinking of.
World Weekly News. Okay.
Have you heard of that?
No, I don't think
No.
so.
Okay. So that was from kind of like my generation. It was back in the 70s and early 80s when that was like extremely. That was like the trashiest parts of the internet, what it is right now, but on paper. So all of this crap existed even back then, pre-internet. It was just in a different form. So okay, now to answer your question, boredom. What role does boredom play? I guess it depends on how you define boredom in this context and who is actually bored. Like, so boredom has never been an issue for me. I think it's incredibly interesting to address the argument critically and just one tiny point and just keep on hammering at it and using logic and reason and going back and forth, because I feel like it's not only a teaching moment for somebody who's not a critical thinker, but it's also a learning moment for me to learn about how the human mind works and why people believe in these crazy things and why some people say the things that they do. So it helps me understand people, and I think that that's a great way to look at it for everybody. Like, look at it as a teaching and a learning moment when you are arguing these small points. That and I understand what you mean. Like, it's not as like exciting when you, if you look at like your YouTube feed and just look at some of the viral videos that have to do with news. They're usually like these totally clickbaity headlines that probably, I would say, maybe 2% are true or accurate or not misleading. The rest are either completely false, inaccurate, or incredibly misleading or deceptive. But that's what gets people's attention. That's what people are interested in. And that's unfortunate, because the truth is often, well, to use your word, boring. It's uninteresting. If we and this is like about American politics, this is a good way to look at one of the big problems with American politics today. You like, yes, I think if you graph everything out and you look at it statistically and data based, you will see that we probably are like more divided. There's more like the ends, the polar ends are a little bit stronger than they have been in the past. Not all the past, though. It's not like this is the worst it's ever been. It's been worse, but the perception is very different, because it's like in this day and age, the extremes get all of the attention. So we're constantly bombarded with these crazy things that either the left are saying or the right are saying, and that's what we see, and that's what like the news likes to represent. And which will bring me to a third fallacy that is one of my favorites, and that's the nut picking fallacy. The idea that you pick out like the craziest person of like a group that you're trying to disparage, and so what you're doing is you're associating with that craziest person with the entire group, and that's done all the time. Like, I don't know how accurate it is. Like, sometimes it's more accurate than others. So for example, like if you were doing a documentary on the Flat Earth Society, you probably would find a crazy person no matter who you interviewed. So that nut of the
Yes.
group would be pretty representative of the entire group. That's
Most
because the
likely,
entire
yes, I
group
think so.
is so crazy, right? So it becomes less of a fallacy. It's like most of these fallacies are based on, like the informal fallacies are based on degrees. Like, you could have like a completely outrageous fallacy, like it could be a complete and total fallacy, or it could be just like a small fallacy. So in that case, if you're getting like the craziest person from the Flat Earth Society, it's probably a small fallacy if you try to represent them as the entire group, because most of the people are pretty crazy. However, if you take like, just pick somebody from, let's say, the Democratic Party, somebody who's says like these crazy, completely, totally like left wing things that maybe 5% of the Democratic Party actually believe or agree with, and you try to represent them as like the norm. And we see this all the time on like right wing media. And when I watch this, I consider myself like an independent. I'm a registered independent. I always have been, but I definitely lean more left these days. So when I see this, somebody on a right wing media say like, and the Democrats or the left wingers believe this, I'm like, what? I'm like, well, I certainly don't believe this, and there's hundreds of people I know that are consider themselves liberal, and I don't know anybody who believes this. Well, that is exactly this nut picking fallacy, and it's also part of the straw man because it's easier to attack these completely outrageous, all the way to the left or all the way to the right positions, rather than like argue and debate about like a solid political position that most people would be probably divided 50-50, and it's usually like, yeah, I could see it either way. But that doesn't sell magazines, or that doesn't attract viewers. What attracts viewers is getting something completely ridiculous and showcasing that, and then trying to sell that person as a representative of the entire group, which is not true. So the bottom line here is, with a nut picking fallacy, whenever you see a media source or anybody try to say, look, this is your typical Democrat, Republican, flat earther, whatever, think twice about that and realize that that's almost certainly not the case. It's probably just an extreme example of somebody who is trying to make a point or trying to disparage that group.
As you were walking through the nut picking fallacy, I couldn't help but think of the no true Scotsman fallacy, which the no true Scotsman for me almost feels like it would be a good would be a fallacy that someone might rebuttal the nut picking fallacy with. Oh hey, that, left wing, right wing candidate, they're freaking crazy. They represent you as a whole. Uh, I think a reasonable fallacy that's, oxymoron, right? Because they're not actually logical, but something that I could see someone using against the nutpicking fallacy is that, oh, well, they were never really a true Republican anyway. They were never a true Democrat anyway. Do you think we have possibly created more fallacies over time to fight other fallacies? And if so, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on, using fallacies to fight fallacies, I suppose, because that the no true Scotsman nut picking fallacy came to mind.
Yeah, so it's not a fallacy if you're correct about it, and if it's like in line
Mm,
with logic and reason. So if you're correcting somebody's nut picking fallacy, and you're saying, well, no, that is not a true representation of the entire group, then that's not fallacious. That's not the no true Scotsman. Whereas the
mm,
no true Scotsman is actually a fallacy when you're
yeah.
saying, oh, that no true Republican would actually say that. And
Mm,
because when you say like true, no real Republican, like who defines this? It's more of a statement of fact when actually it's not. And one of the best examples of this, and I have to get political here, because the best example is this whole new wave of rhino. You've probably heard that term, Republicans in name only. And what they are is just your typical Republicans who aren't part of the MAGA party. So now, like, and I think like Trump is one of the biggest committers of this fallacy. You're saying no true Republican. I mean, essentially, that's what you're saying. Like, oh, he's a rhino. So you're saying that they're essentially it's the no true Scotsman, but you're saying no true Republican. No true Republican would think that Trump really didn't win. So therefore, they're a rhino. They're a Republican in name only. So it's a way to other this group. And this is a really good example because we see it pretty much every day. And so, like, who defines it? Like, if you actually look at like the Republican Party and what they stand for, like online, I think that's probably more official than hearing one of the Republican leaders saying no true Republican would do this or believe this or say this. So it's incredibly common, and it's common with religion too. Like, oh,
Absolutely.
this Christian just murdered all these people. No, he wasn't a Christian. No true Christian would murder. And then, so if you take the definition of true Christian, okay, one that doesn't murder, one that doesn't do this, one that do, you end up with no Christians, right? And that's kind of the point. You can't just dismiss somebody from your in group based on a behavior that you don't like and try to disassociate that person with your in group, when the fact is your in group is a lot more variable and a lot more different than you would like to believe or you want people to believe. And that's the reality of things. There are very good people and very bad people. There are, like, in every group. So it's just a way to try to get those bad people or people who do bad things out of your group, and try to kind of mislead people on what that group is all about, rather than seeing the true group of what it actually contains and what it's made up of.
You mentioned earlier, a news article growing up. These fallacies have existed. You mentioned in your book, which I'd never heard of, that Aristotle first introduced the idea of fallacies in his work on sophistical refutations. Then we have a lot of other authors, from the 1600s, obviously, all the way until present day. These have always existed. Like, I assume fallacies appear with language anywhere. Pretty tough to get rid of. In your research, I assume talking with people, seeing them in real life, how do we become better? I mean, I think, again, you bring this up in the book, arguer tends to have like a negative connotation, but you're arguing for a point, and so we'll use it in its actual definition. How do we become better arguers? How do we get better at presenting evidence? How do we get better at self-analysis? But how do we get better at presenting data, convincing in general?
Well, being aware of the fallacies, that's one of the points, but having the right information at your fingertips. And kind of, I think another important point is sticking with what you know versus what you don't know. And I feel like, especially in the social media age, people feel like they have to have an opinion on everything. And it's not only annoying, but it spreads misinformation and wrong information. Like, I was like just talking with I won't say who, but to protect their identity, but they were telling me how this person who is on trial is innocent and didn't do all that. And I'm thinking, how could you say that? Like, you're not a legal expert. You're not a tax expert. You don't have this information. You're not privy to all the information that the jury has or the judge has. This is all private. Like, how could you possibly say that? They're just making things up. And when you do that, when you're like so strongly connected to an ideological position, then it's very difficult to have logical and reasonable arguments. I think one of the best things you could possibly do is try to release yourself of any strong ideological position that you have. And by that, I mean like the three main categories. I mean politics, religion, and social issues. And once you do that, once you agree to like just accept evidence and the truth and just follow evidence where it leads and make up your mind. And when you don't associate yourself, like your identity isn't based on a political party, on a religion, or on a social issue, then you find yourself making much, much better arguments because you're not supporting an argument that you really don't believe. because when people argue for something, they're arguing basically to protect their own identity. So when somebody's a Christian, for example, they don't say, I believe in Christianity. They say, I am a Christian. It's their identity. They see it as who they are. So if you attack Christianity, or if you say something that's negative against Christianity, they'll be seeing that as an attack against them, which isn't unreasonable. And I get annoyed when people say, oh, it's all about the argument, not the person, not the arguer. So just attack the idea and not the person, and you're going to be okay. Well, it's not that easy. It doesn't work that way, because people identify themselves with the argument. So when you are attacking like Christianity, you are in a sense attacking the Christian. And there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean you don't attack Christianity. If something's wrong, it's wrong. Like if there's a point in Christianity that's completely false, or then you should bring it up and you should say it, and that other person needs to accept it. But when, from the other perspective, like when you are a Christian, then if somebody says, like maybe you believe that Adam and Eve were real people who were on the earth 6,000 years ago, and that's
Used
when
to.
the earth was, yeah. Then and somebody says, well, I could basically provide you with books and books and books of information on how that's not true, and I could talk to you for 24 hours and tell you all the reasons why that's not completely true. Then you feel like, well, I got to defend this, because if this part isn't true, then what does that say about these other parts of my religion? Like it's kind of like a foundation. And then if that foundation is destroyed, then everything else starts to fall down. And I don't know if you said that you came out of Mormonism, but that's probably what happened. That I was a Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and essentially that's what happened. You start to look at these foundational ideas, and when you see like the evidence and rational arguments, and these like most ridiculous foundational ideas kind of fall apart, then everything else kind of falls apart. So the foundation falls and everything else falls, and then one day you find yourself like, wow, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that anymore. But when you have these strong ideological positions, it's incredibly difficult. If you identify like as a Republican, I am a Republican, I've been a lifelong Republican. When the Republican Party starts to change, you're faced with this massive cognitive dissonance, because you say like, whoa, I don't believe that, or this is crazy, but I am a Republican, so what am I going to do? I have to believe this. And you walk people through. I mean, that's the way that this works. These are these small steps. You find yourself taking these small steps, and then eventually either one or two things happen. You're either like not at all the person you were, because you are believing or espousing these crazy things that you would never do before, because you were walked that way step by step, or you find yourself at a point where you say, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. I can't associate with this group. And to give you a personal example, after my whole like moving away from Catholicism, I kind of settled on humanism, and I was part of the American Humanist Association, and that was a great example where I saw the things that they were starting to say. They were starting to get incredibly political, and it wasn't about religion or secular values. They were trying to associate like these completely outrageous secular positions, or I'm sorry, these social positions with secular beliefs. And it was like I was like, okay, I guess I could go that far. I guess I could take that one. But at some point, I'm like, I'm out of here. This is like not. I don't believe these things. I can't be associated with this group anymore. So I left, and I don't feel the need anymore to defend secular humanism as it's defined by the American Humanist Association, because I'm free of that. I get to look at religion and atheism and agnosticism and all these different points, deism, and I get to look at everything from based on the merits of the argument itself. And I have no horse in the game. So if there's a good point, I will acknowledge it. And I could do that because I'm not defending my ideology. So this is a long way of saying, think about your ideological beliefs. Like, what do you really feel strongly about? And then I think the question is, why do you feel so strongly about it? Is it because of your social groups? Is it the way you were brought up? You were born into it? Have you been kind of like, I hate to use the word, but I think it's an accurate word, poisoned by some information on a certain network or a certain like YouTube stream or something? And try to, if you really want to become a good critical thinker, you really want to be reasonable, try to disassociate yourself with all of these ideologies. That is like the first and most important major step. If you could do that, then you will start finding that every argument that you see, every position, you've, first of all, it's incredibly freeing because no longer do you have to manipulate and change and kind of like do these mental gymnastics to try to support this argument or support this person who's part of your group. You don't have to do that anymore. You could just say, yeah, this person is totally crazy. And you could go where the facts lead you. So it's a wonderful way to start.
And it's so tough, like actually parsing out what you believe, because how do we even register belief? Like generally it's just like, oh, that feels good. But like to your point, like figure out why it feels good. Like maybe it just feels good because it means that there's a group waiting to accept you with open arms.
Sure.
One of the good like thought raisers that I've used in my life to kind of like, to discern kind of where my beliefs are coming from. Would I still believe this if it like made me alone? Like if it forced me to kind of be outcast, would I still believe this even if it cost me some friendships? Would I still believe this even if it cost me some community? And if the answer is yes, generally it's like, oh, wow, I think this is actually something that I believe, that I've chosen to believe. And so I think it's incredibly difficult for someone to do that individually because, again, to your point, why do you believe what you believe? Yeah. And hell, even as I say that, I may think, oh, I'm going to lose these friends, lose this community, but maybe subconsciously I'm thinking, but I know there's people out there that believe the same way. So it is tough. We're social creatures at the end of the day. Anything that truly makes us feel alone is something to question, I think. But Bo, I really appreciate you. This has been a fun conversation. Where can people learn more about you? Where can people buy your books? We'll link everything below.
Okay, great. So there are two main websites for me. One is my business website where all my businesses are connected and you could link to those, jump around, see what I do. And that's archieboy.com. And if you're interested in my books, most of them are on the area of critical thinking, logic, reason, got some religion mixed in there, a lot of psychology, and then some fun stuff too. You can find all that at bobennett.com, BOBENNETT.com.
And for everyone listening, the book we've been referencing the whole conversation is called Logically Fallacious, the ultimate collection of over 300 logical fallacies. Dr. Bo, appreciate you. Thanks for being on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hey everyone, Andrew here. Just want to thank you for making it to the end of this video and to ask you to subscribe, to like, to share this wherever you can if it provided any value to you. If it didn't, I don't want you to. I'm still learning to do this thing. I'm still learning to provide value. I'm still learning to interview and all the sorts. So, but if you did get some value from this or enjoyed it, whether it's knowledge or entertainment, I ask that you do those things. But regardless, hope you have a great day and hope you enjoyed. Thank you.